What happens when a scarred lip, a whiskey glass, and a trail of failed marriages create not a cautionary tale, but the greatest movie star who ever lived? Humphrey Bogart became immortal not by hiding his flaws, but by making them the very definition of cool. January 14th, 1957, Holmby Hills, Los Angeles. The man who had stared down Nazis in Casablanca and faced death in dozens of films lay dying in his bedroom, his famous voice reduced to a whisper by esophageal cancer. Lauren Bacall held his hand as he slipped away, the same hand that had raised countless glasses of whiskey, lit infinite cigarettes, and created gestures that would define masculinity for generations. His last coherent words weren't movie dialogue or philosophical wisdom, they were brutally honest. I should have quit drinking 20 years ago. In that moment, Hollywood's toughest guy revealed what made him truly immortal. Not perfection, but the courage to be imperfect in a world that demanded flawless heroes. The obituaries called him the last of the great movie stars, but they missed the revolutionary truth. Bogart wasn't great because he was perfect. He was great because he wasn't. In an industry built on selling dreams of flawless leading men, he had made millions fall in love with someone who looked like he'd been through hell and lived to tell about it. Fedora tilted, cigarette lit, shadows deep. Bogart didn't just play Noir. He became it. But how did a privileged New York kid with a speech impediment become the embodiment of American masculinity? How did physical scars become emotional armor? And why does his image, standing in doorways, collar turned up, eyes wary, still define what it means to be cool nearly 70 years later? To understand how imperfection became immortal, we must first understand how an ordinary boy learned to embrace extraordinary flaws. New York City, December 25th, 1899. Christmas Day births are supposed to be blessed, but Humphrey DeForest Bogart entered the world during a blizzard that seemed to foreshadow the storms ahead. Born into Manhattan privilege on West 103rd Street, he was everything a respectable family's son should be. Handsome enough to model for his mother Maud's magazine illustrations. Intelligent enough for Harvard, wealthy enough never to worry about money. The Bogart household on the Upper West Side was museum-perfect respectability. Dr. Belmont DeForest Bogart, one of New York's most successful surgeons, expected his eldest son to follow him into medicine. The family brownstone was filled with medical texts and surgical instruments, the quiet authority that came with saving lives for a living. Maud Humphrey was equally accomplished. Her commercial illustrations of cherubic children appeared in magazines nationwide, making her one of the most successful female artists of her era. She had studied in Paris, moved in sophisticated artistic circles, and hoped her refined sensibilities would inspire young Humphrey toward creative pursuits that matched the family's cultural aspirations. Neither parent could have imagined their son would become famous playing criminals, cynics, and broken-hearted romantics who inhabited the shadows, rather than the drawing rooms they knew so well. Young Humphrey was contradiction incarnate from his earliest years. Beautiful enough to serve as model for his mother's idealized children's portraits, yet increasingly drawn to the rougher kids who hung around the Hudson River docks. Brilliant enough to excel in any academic subject that interested him, yet constantly in trouble for questioning authority and challenging teachers who demanded unthinking obedience. His parents' solution was typically upper class. Better schools would surely correct what they saw as wayward tendencies. They sent him first to Trinity School on Manhattan's Upper West Side, then to Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. Institutions designed to shape wealthy boys into refined gentlemen who would take their places in society's upper echelons. But Humphrey was developing stubborn independence that would define his life. At Phillips Academy, he preferred sailing small boats on nearby lakes to studying Latin conjugations. He preferred poker games with townies to formal dinners with faculty. His grades suffered not from lack of intelligence but from complete disinterest in conforming to expectations that felt artificial and constraining. When he was expelled just months before graduation, officially for poor grades, unofficially for attitude problems that made him unsuitable for Harvard, it surprised no one who had tried to teach him. The boy who should have been destined for Harvard Law School had chosen rebellion over respectability. The decision that changed everything came at 18. Rather than pursue college or enter his father's medical practice, Humphrey shocked his family by enlisting in the Navy during World War I. For a privileged young man who had never faced real hardship or lived outside his parents' protective influence, military service promised both adventure and escape from suffocating expectations. Naval service transformed Humphrey fundamentally in ways that would shape his entire approach to life and work. The rigid hierarchy taught him about loyalty, honor, and the bonds that form between men facing danger together. The rough camaraderie of enlisted men introduced him to authentic masculinity he had never experienced in his sheltered upbringing. Men who proved their worth through actions rather than social connections. He learned to drink with sailors from backgrounds completely different from his own, to gamble with dock workers who had never heard of Phillips Academy, to hold his own in conversations that would have horrified his mother's refined social circle. The experience stripped away much of his privileged assumptions about class and breeding, replacing them with harder-won understanding about character and courage. But it was a seemingly minor injury that would give Bogart his most distinctive characteristic and launch his path towards stardom. While escorting a naval prisoner from the brig to Portsmouth Naval Prison, the man attempted escape by striking Bogart in the mouth with his metal shackles. The blow split his lip and damaged nerves that controlled the upper portion of his mouth, leaving him with partial paralysis that created a slight lisp and gave his voice the distinctive quality that would become his trademark. What could have been seen as disfigurement became instead his signature. The slight slur in his speech, the way his lip curled skeptically when he smiled, the perpetually questioning expression, all of these would later make him perfect for playing men who had seen too much of the world's cruelty and trusted too little of its promises. The Navy had given him the face and voice that would launch 1,000 film noir plots. From scar to star. But the journey wasn't immediate or straightforward. Returning to civilian life in New York in 1920, Humphrey found himself caught between worlds that no longer seemed to fit. Too rough around the edges for his parents' society friends, too refined and educated for the working-class men he had served alongside, he drifted into the only profession that seemed to welcome such contradictions: the theater. Through family connections and his own determination, he found work as a stage manager and bit part actor, learning the business from the ground up. His early theatrical career was unremarkable by any objective standard. Small roles in forgettable plays, occasional reviewing jobs that barely paid his Manhattan rent, long periods between engagements when he questioned whether he had chosen the right profession. But the theater taught him crucial lessons about character development and emotional truth that would serve him well when he eventually moved to Hollywood. More importantly, it introduced him to people who appreciated his particular combination of toughness and vulnerability, who saw his damaged good looks and slightly slurred speech as assets rather than limitations. The personal relationships that began during these theater years established patterns that would repeat throughout his life. His first marriage to Helen Menken in 1926 was passionate but brief, lasting only 10 months before their fundamental incompatibilities destroyed it. Helen was an established Broadway actress with her own career ambitions, and neither of them knew how to balance two strong personalities within the constraints of 1920s marriage expectations. His second marriage to Mary Phillips in 1928 survived longer, nearly a decade, but ultimately foundered on similar issues. Mary was also an actress, and their careers often pulled them in different directions. Bogart was learning that the qualities that made him compelling on stage, his intensity, his emotional guardedness, his fierce need for independence, made him difficult to live with as a husband. The move to Hollywood in 1930 should have been triumph, but Bogart discovered he didn't fit existing categories. The film industry was still adjusting to the demands of sound pictures, and casting directors weren't sure what to make of an actor who defied their established templates. He was too old to be a juvenile lead, too unconventionally handsome to be a romantic hero, too intelligent and articulate to play simple thugs and gangsters. For the better part of a decade, Bogart bounced between Broadway and Hollywood, taking whatever roles he could find to pay the bills while gradually learning the different demands of film acting. The techniques that worked on stage, broader gestures, projected voices, theatrical timing, had to be scaled down and made more intimate for the movie camera. The breakthrough role that would define the rest of his career came in 1935 with Duke Manty in Robert Sherwood's The Petrified Forest. Bogart originated the role on Broadway, playing a desperate killer who holds a group of travelers hostage in a remote Arizona diner. The character should have been simply unsympathetic, a violent criminal terrorizing innocent people. But Bogart invested him with a weary dignity that made audiences understand his desperation rather than simply fear his violence. When Warner Brothers decided to adapt the play for the screen, they initially planned to cast Edward G. Robinson in the Manty role, figuring that an established movie star would be safer than a relatively unknown stage actor. But Leslie Howard, who was reprising his Broadway role as the idealistic writer Alan Squire, insisted that Bogart be given the film role as well. Howard recognized that Bogart had found something essential in the character that couldn't be replicated by another actor. The film version of The Petrified Forest introduced movie audiences to a new kind of screen presence. Critics noted that Bogart didn't just play Duke Manty, he seemed to inhabit him completely, as if the desperate killer was a part of himself he had finally found permission to reveal. The performance established the template for everything that would follow. Men operating outside conventional morality not because they were evil, but because they had been forced by circumstances to develop their own ethical codes. Warner Brothers signed Bogart to a long-term contract, but the early Hollywood years were frustrating in ways that tested his determination. The studio saw him primarily as a character actor useful for playing gangsters and villains, but lacking the conventional good looks and romantic appeal needed for leading man roles. Jack Warner and his executives had very specific ideas about what movie stars should look like, and Bogart's scarred lip and slightly aggressive demeanor didn't fit their templates. Bogart chafed against these limitations, knowing he had far more range than the scripts allowed him to demonstrate. He fought with directors who wanted him to play cartoon villains, argued with producers who couldn't see past his tough guy exterior, and developed a reputation for being difficult that would follow him throughout his career. But being difficult also meant being discriminating, and Bogart gradually learned to choose roles that played to his strengths rather than trying to conform to Hollywood's narrow definitions of stardom. His marriage to Mayo Method in 1938 brought both passion and chaos into his personal life. Mayo was a talented actress in her own right, but she was also volatile, jealous, and struggled with alcohol in ways that amplified Bogart's own drinking. Their relationship was intensely physical and emotional, marked by epic fights that became legendary throughout Hollywood. The press dubbed them the Battling Bogarts, treating their domestic violence as entertainment rather than recognizing the serious problems underlying their relationship. The battles with Mayo often spilled over into his professional life. He would arrive on set with scratches on his face from their latest fight, or disappear for days when their arguments became too intense to resolve quickly. The drinking that had been moderate during his bachelor years became heavier and more problematic as he used alcohol to cope with the stress of an increasingly turbulent marriage. The Maltese Falcon in 1941 established the definitive template for both Bogart's career and the film noir genre itself. Director John Huston understood what other filmmakers had missed. Bogart's imperfections weren't limitations to overcome, but strengths to exploit. As Sam Spade, Bogart created the archetypal noir protagonist, cynical enough to understand the corruption around him, tough enough to survive it, but ultimately moral enough to do the right thing when the stakes were highest. The role allowed Bogart to synthesize everything he had learned about character development over the previous decade. Spade was neither hero nor villain, but something more complex and interesting. A man who operated by his own ethical code in a world where traditional morality had broken down. The performance proved that Bogart could carry a major film as a leading man while remaining true to his particular brand of damaged masculinity. But it was Casablanca in 1942 that transformed Bogart from accomplished character actor to cultural icon whose influence would extend far beyond the boundaries of cinema. Rick Blaine was the perfect vehicle for his talents. A man whose surface cynicism masked deep romanticism, whose casual cruelty concealed profound loyalty, whose apparent selfishness ultimately gave way to genuine heroism when tested by circumstances beyond his control. The production of Casablanca was famously chaotic, with pages of script being rewritten daily and major plot points remaining unresolved until the final weeks of filming. But the uncertainty seemed to liberate Bogart's performance, allowing him to discover Rick's essential nature through improvisation and instinct rather than careful preparation. The famous airport scene, Rick sending Ilsa away with her husband Victor Laszlo, became a cultural touchstone not because it was perfectly choreographed, but because Bogart invested it with authentic emotional pain. When he delivers the line, "Here's looking at you, kid," one final time, audiences believed his heartbreak because they could see it in his eyes, hear it in the slight crack in his voice, feel it in the way he held himself just a little too rigidly. "We'll Always Have Paris" entered American mythology because Bogart understood that Rick's sacrifice wasn't a heroic gesture but a necessary choice for a man who had finally found something worth protecting. The performance worked because it was honest, not about perfect love but about imperfect people trying to do the right thing in impossible circumstances. The success of Casablanca should have simplified Bogart's personal life, but fame brought its own complications. The destructive pattern with Mayo Method intensified as his career reached new heights. Their fights became more frequent and more violent, fueled by mutual jealousy and increasing alcohol consumption on both sides. Mayo was suspicious of every leading lady Bogart worked with, while he resented her attempts to control his social and professional activities. Salvation came in the most unexpected form. Lauren Bacall, a 19-year-old model from New York making her film debut in Howard Hawks' To Have and Have Not in 1944. At 25 years his senior, she should have been just another co-star in what was expected to be a routine wartime adventure film. Instead, something chemical happened between them that would transform both their lives. The famous scene where Bacall's character explains to Bogart's Harry Morgan how to get her attention. "You know how to whistle, don't you, Steve? You just put your lips together and blow," was capturing lightning in a bottle. Their chemistry was so obvious and immediate that director Howard Hawks had to reshoot several scenes because they were falling in love in real time, playing to each other instead of to the cameras. Betty Joan Persky, who became Lauren Bacall for the movies, saw past Bogart's carefully constructed toughness to the vulnerable, intelligent, surprisingly gentle man underneath. She wasn't intimidated by his reputation for being difficult, or by the drinking that was becoming problematic. Instead, she challenged him to be better than he thought possible, bringing out qualities that had been buried under years of disappointment and defensive cynicism. Marriage to Bacall in 1945, following his divorce from Mayo, marked the beginning of Bogart's happiest and most productive period. She brought emotional stability to his life without trying to change his essential nature, while he provided the security and protection she needed to develop her own career in an industry that could be brutal to young women. The Big Sleep, 1946, showcased their chemistry at its absolute peak, playing Raymond Chandler's detective Philip Marlowe opposite Bacall's Vivian Rutledge. Bogart created another definitive noir protagonist while exploring a more romantic side of his screen persona. The film's famously complex plot became secondary to the sexual tension and verbal sparring between the leads. His later roles reflected this growing complexity and willingness to explore darker aspects of human nature. In John Huston's The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, 1948, he played Fred C. Dobbs, a man gradually destroyed by greed and paranoia. The role required Bogart to chart a complete moral breakdown, showing sides of human nature that his previous films had only hinted at. The performance was uncomfortable in its psychological penetration. Dobbs wasn't a sympathetic anti-hero struggling against corruption, but a genuinely disturbed individual whose paranoia leads to violence and ultimately death. Bogart inhabited the role so completely that audiences were disturbed by seeing their favorite tough guy transformed into something genuinely frightening and pathetic. In A Lonely Place, 1950 may have been his most personally revealing film, playing screenwriter Dixon Steele, whose violent temper destroys his relationships with everyone he loves. The character's struggle with anger, self-destructive impulses, and inability to connect emotionally seem to draw directly from Bogart's own experiences, creating a performance of uncomfortable self-examination. As he entered his 50s, Bogart began contemplating mortality in ways that his younger self had studiously avoided. The constant smoking that had been part of his image since his theater days, combined with the heavy drinking that had escalated during his marriage to Mayo, was beginning to take a visible toll. His voice became more gravelly, his breathing more labored, but he dismissed these changes as natural aging. The African Queen, 1951, paired him with Katharine Hepburn in a role that allowed him to demonstrate his comedy skills while maintaining his essential toughness. Playing Charlie Allnut, the gin-soaked boat captain who helps Hepburn's missionary navigate dangerous African waters, required Bogart to show both vulnerability and strength in ways that felt fresh and unexpected. The film's production in Africa was grueling, with both stars suffering from various tropical illnesses and dealing with primitive filming conditions. But the challenges seemed to bring out the best in both performances, and the movie became both a critical and commercial success. The role earned him his only Academy Award, recognition that validated his belief that authentic performance trumped manufactured star quality. The Caine Mutiny, 1954, gave him one of his most psychologically complex characters in Captain Queeg, a naval officer whose authority masks deep insecurity and mental instability. The role required Bogart to play completely against type, not the tough guy who could handle any crisis, but a broken man whose facade of competence crumbles under pressure. The famous courtroom scene where Queeg's paranoid rambling reveals his psychological breakdown was a masterpiece of controlled performance. Bogart showed Queeg's disintegration through subtle changes in posture, voice, and facial expression, creating a portrait of mental illness that was both sympathetic and frightening. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore his declining health. The persistent cough that had developed over years of heavy smoking was getting noticeably worse, and he was losing weight despite maintaining his usual appetite. Bacall urged him repeatedly to see doctors, but Bogart resisted medical attention with the same stubbornness that had characterized his entire approach to life. When the cancer diagnosis finally came in early 1956, it wasn't entirely unexpected given his lifestyle, but it was devastating nonetheless. Esophageal cancer, directly linked to his decades of heavy smoking and drinking, was particularly aggressive and had already spread by the time it was discovered. The doctors were honest about his prognosis. He had months, not years. The final year of Bogart's life revealed both his courage and his fundamental humanity in ways that his toughest screen roles could only hint at. He faced the disease with the same stoic determination he had brought to his most challenging performances. But he also showed vulnerability and fear that made him more human rather than less heroic. He continued working as long as he was physically able, treating each day as a gift rather than dwelling on what he was losing. Friends from across the entertainment industry rallied around him with loyalty that reflected the genuine affection he had inspired despite his reputation for being difficult and demanding. Bacall became both wife and nurse during his final months, caring for him with devotion that belied the age difference and skepticism their marriage had initially generated. She later wrote that watching him face death taught her about courage and grace under pressure in ways that no performance or director ever could. The end came quietly on January 14, 1957, without dramatic final words or profound philosophical statements. Bogart simply stopped breathing, leaving behind a body of work that would define cinematic masculinity for generations, and a personal example of how to face both success and failure with equal dignity. January 14, 1957. Hollywood lost something irreplaceable, not just a talented actor, but an authentic human being who had refused to sacrifice truth for image throughout his entire career. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners, but perhaps the most telling tribute was the complete absence of Hollywood phoniness. The grief was genuine, the stories shared were honest, and the sense of loss was real. In the months and years following his death, Bogart's reputation continued to grow rather than fade. Film critics began to recognize that what they had sometimes dismissed as limited range was actually remarkable consistency of vision. A refusal to betray the essential truth of his screen persona, even when it would have been easier or more profitable to follow changing fashions. The American Film Institute's eventual designation of Bogart as the greatest male movie star in American cinema history surprised no one who understood his lasting influence on both the industry and popular culture. But the honor also recognized something deeper, that his approach to acting and stardom had created a template for masculinity that remained relevant long after the era that created it had passed. Film schools began studying his performances not just as examples of effective screen acting, but as masterclasses in character consistency and emotional authenticity. Students learned that Bogart's apparent simplicity masked sophisticated technique, that his most powerful moments came from subtle reactions and carefully chosen stillness rather than grand gestures. Contemporary actors began citing him as influence not because they wanted to copy his mannerisms, but because they admired his unwavering commitment to truth over showiness. His approach, finding the authentic emotion in every scene, refusing to play moments he couldn't believe, became a standard for actors who wanted substance rather than just style. The revival of film noir brought renewed attention to his work. Critics recognized that he hadn't just acted in noir films, he had helped define what noir masculinity looked like. His influence could be seen in every fedora-wearing detective, every cynical hero, every man who protected others while protecting himself. Cultural historians began to understand that Bogart represented something uniquely American. The idea that redemption was possible for anyone, that moral complexity was more interesting than simple heroism, that being tough didn't require being heartless. International audiences discovered his work through revival theaters and home video. His appeal crossed cultural boundaries because the emotions he portrayed, loneliness, loyalty, romantic loss, moral courage, were universal human experiences that transcended specific cultural contexts. The smoking and drinking that had contributed to his death became cautionary rather than glamorous elements of his legend. Later generations understood that these behaviors were part of his personal struggle rather than essential elements of his appeal, separating the artist from the self-destructive habits that had killed him. Film restoration projects brought his work to new audiences with improved quality, revealing details invisible in earlier prints. Viewers could see the subtlety of his facial expressions, the careful modulation of his voice, the precise physical choices that made his performances so compelling. Quotes attributed to him became part of American vocabulary. "Here's looking at you, kid," and "We'll always have Paris" joined the pantheon of movie lines carrying meaning beyond their original context, representing ideals of romantic devotion and graceful sacrifice. Contemporary filmmakers continued to study his work for insights into pacing, dialogue delivery, and atmosphere creation. Directors like Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino acknowledged his influence on their understanding of how violence and tenderness could coexist in the same character. He wasn't perfect, he was real, and that's why he lasted. In a town built on manufacturing dreams, Bogart proved that truth was the only reliable ticket to genuine immortality. His legacy rested not in the awards he won, but in the proof he provided that an artist could remain fundamentally authentic in a system designed to eliminate authenticity. "I'm not the hero they think I am," he had once admitted. "I'm just a man trying not to be broken." In the end, that honesty, that willingness to admit imperfection while never stopping the effort to be something better, became the true source of his immortality. He didn't become a legend despite his flaws, he became a legend because of them. Humphrey Bogart died as he had lived, without pretense, surrounded by people who loved him for who he actually was, rather than what he represented to the public. His final confession about drinking revealed what had made him truly great: the courage to be honest about his failures while never abandoning the struggle to become something better. Was Bogart's scar his greatest curse, or his greatest gift? Did Casablanca make him immortal, or was it his imperfections that kept him alive in culture? In our age of manufactured perfection, what can we learn from a man who became immortal by refusing to pretend he was anything other than beautifully, authentically human?